Hello and welcome to the Moonshots podcast. It's episode 51. I'm your co-host, Mike Parsons, and as always, I'm joined by the man in springtime Brooklyn, Mr. Chad Owen. Hello, Chad.
Hey, Mike, it's finally spring. Spring has sprung.
I know.
The sun is out and there's not a cloud in the sky. I'm finally happy that spring has arrived.
And so am I, because you and I are going to be catching up in a couple of weeks' time. And it's very nice to open my weather app and see that it's not some Arctic conditions and have me scrambling for beanies and gloves. It's really nice to see that we're going to have a gentler weather condition this time around.
Yeah, you can leave your quote unquote winter coats, which is just like a light jacket at home in Sydney.
Absolutely. And look, I tell you what, we have had a blast on this architect series, and so many of these architects have done amazing things in your hometown of New York. And I think it's safe to say our fourth and final architect is living up to that promise as well. Who do we have installed, Chad Owen?
Yeah, so our fourth architect in the architecture series here, wrapping it all up, is someone from the other side of the pond, from a little Danish town called Copenhagen. And we're going to be profiling Bjarke Ingels of the Bjarke Ingels Group.
Now, we're really fond of Bjarke because he's done some weird, wonderful, challenging, curious, stunning buildings. But my pitch for you here, Chad, is, you know, we have had some titans of architecture on this series. Zaha on our 50th anniversary show. And obviously, you know, Lloyd Wright, Norman Foster, Frank Gehry. But Bjarke, this guy, I mean, he is, I would pin him as the Elon Musk of architecture. He's quite the challenger brand, isn't he, Chad?
Yeah, and that's why his name kind of leapt to mind as soon as we were talking about doing a series on architects. And while you weren't very familiar with him, I think just from a trip that Nicole and I had taken, my wife and I had taken to Copenhagen a couple of years ago, she's an architect, and made sure that we stopped by some of the buildings that Big had built around Copenhagen. And I was just really struck by them. And then when I kind of found out, did some research on him and kind of found his Elon-like personality, I thought he'd be a perfect fit for this show because he's a little out there. He's a little bit of a pitch and hype man, but what they have built thus far are some really interesting specimens that I'm excited to talk with you and learn from Bjarke on today's show.
Yeah, I have to thank you, Chad. I really had no idea who Bjarke Ingels was prior to you suggesting him. And, you know, digging into it, there's two buildings that just leap out that are signature Bjarke Ingels and very disruptive. And so for those of you who are not driving and on your commute, but perhaps on the train or the tram, have a little bit of a Google around for these two buildings. The first one is Copenhill. You know, so think about Copenhagen, Copenhill, and it was a waste management plant that we're going to talk about further in this show, but they've converted it into an alpine ski resort in the middle of Copenhagen. Mm-hmm. This building is ridiculous. It's so much fun. I mean, I just love this Copenhill, don't you?
Yeah, well, Bjarke was kind of joking that there's lots of snow in Denmark and in Copenhagen, but it's all flat. There's no mountains. And so they used this giant, industrial building and turned it into a ski slope. The other building that you are going to point us to, Mike, is actually one of my favorites. And if you Google it, be sure you find some of the aerial shots of the Lego house, which is a new Lego museum in Denmark, the home country of Lego. And it's just like a giant set of Lego bricks.
But come
There's no
on,
other way to
we've
describe
got we got to give just a little bit of the magic here. This is a building you can walk into, but Chad, what's it made out of completely? If it's the Lego house, they made it out of
Legos, of course.
yeah. How cool is that?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really colorful, and the spaces inside, I think, do a really fantastic job of, incorporating the playfulness of the product right into the building, which I think is really fascinating.
Right. And if you look into Bjarke Ingels New York, you're going to see that he's got lots of stunning plans, all related to United Nations and all sorts of other things. And this guy, he's our age, he's early 40s, and he is absolutely red hot at the moment. Whether you're in Europe or the US, he is architect du jour. So we've got a lot to learn from him in the show. So if you're listening to the show, be sure to go and check out all the show notes on moonshots.io. We have all the links and all the goodies there. You can pick up, all our archive shows as well. But Chad, we got so much to cover. He's got some great advice. And I think that's not only for architects, but for any entrepreneur or innovator. We can have a little peek into some of the buildings he did and how he thought about them.
Mm-hmm.
But he's got some pretty smart thinking. And again, this is where he's a lot like Elon Musk. What we really wanted to share is how he thinks, how he's built this massive architectural firm called Big, where they win projects all over the world. So he's very much a great artist and a great entrepreneur. So we've got lots and lots and lots to share with each other, with our audience. And I'm super pumped. I think there's a lot to learn from Bjarke Ingels.
Yeah, and so to start the show, we've got a great clip from Bjarke, really just introducing us to a few of his buildings, and also talking a bit, getting again into his mindset and how he thinks. Where he for him, it's all about tweaking the status quo. So let's hear from Bjarke.
When I started studying architecture and told people what I did, the most frequently asked question was always, can you tell me why all new buildings are so boring? People had the idea that in the past buildings came with ornaments and decoration, moats, drawbridges, spires and gargoyles. Today they had been reduced to containers of space, boring and boxy. Somehow so many of our choices today tend to settle with reaffirming the status quo by replicating what's already there rather than inventing what could happen next. I decided I wanted to change that. In the movie Inception, the architects find that they can finally realize their wildest dreams because they're in fact designing inside a dream. The architect hero Cobb explains how he and his wife wanted to live in a house with a garden, but preferred to live in a high-rise. In real life, we would have to choose, he says, but in a dream, we could get it as we wanted it. We've made a building in Copenhagen called The Mountain, combining a parking structure and an apartment building. By turning the parking into a man-made mountain of cars, we can turn the stack of homes into a cascade of houses with gardens, penthouse views and big lawns. Cobb's dream home made in real life. We call this idea bigamy, that you can take multiple desirable elements that might not fit together or even seem mutually exclusive, like the garden home in the high-rise, and merge them together into a new genre. You don't have to remain faithful to a single idea. You can literally marry multiple ideas into promiscuous hybrids. The beauty is that architecture not only allows you to dream stuff up, it also allows you to alter the facts. You can turn pure fiction into hard fact. We went on to imagine little tweaks of the status quo that now form everyday reality in Copenhagen and beyond. The 8 House is a neighborhood of townhouses where you can walk and bicycle from the street to the penthouse, turning a city block into a Mediterranean mountain town of paths and squares. The harbor bath brings the beach into the heart of the city, realizing the Parisian slogan of May 68, "Sous le pavé la plage." The court scraper combines the urban oasis of the courtyard with the extreme density of a skyscraper into a new warped hybrid of the two.
Wow. He's pretty polished. I mean, my first reaction, Chad, is compare him to the sort of natural, rough-edged Frank Gehry who's just doing a thing and throwing paper in the waste paper basket, and then I look at it, I see a shape, just very nature, human, intentional. Bjarke is so polished, and he's so about the clash of worlds, the clash of ideas. Where the real inspiration,
Yeah, with a dash of celebrity in there too,
yeah,
with his
and
movie references.
yes, and the nice Parisian twist, and we call this bigamy. Everything is trademarked, but I mean, jesting aside, what he is clearly pointing out for us right here is he's taking ideas. Well, just because I live in an apartment doesn't mean I can't have a garden. Now, while that thought is simple, almost everybody in the world who lives in an apartment doesn't enjoy their own garden, but yet he designs apartments with gardens, and they're fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
And this challenging of the status quo, this contrarian approach, which takes so much courage, is signature innovative. It's he is literally Elon Musk in architecture. And I think this is where we can jump off into a world of Bjarke Ingels. This, for me, is like a huge learning. Challenge the status quo. Ask, why do we accept the ordinary? Why can't we have the magical?
Yeah. I think what I love most about Bjarke and his personality is how much he challenges convention. Instead of, as he says, keep things the way they are, just replicate something that's already been done. Let's dream about what we actually want and try to make it happen.
Yeah.
And there's something really nice about, someone that's trying to move the field forward in such a way. So he talks about the 8 House, which is a place that I did get to visit when I was in Copenhagen. And he is correct. There's points of the building. So imagine a figure 8, if you looked at it from above, with courtyards in the two middle kind of round sections. And at some points, the building touches the ground. So as he says, you could kind of ride your bike up and then imagine kind of going on an infinite loop around on the top of this building, but you're changing elevation as you're going. So it's a very different way of moving around an apartment complex. It's not like a high-rise building with a cross, floor plan, and you can't help but think that you're in some kind of new community and new space when you're in that kind of built environment. And so, yeah, I love how much he challenges the status quo. Like when you're in a place like that at the 8 House, like you're not on my block here in Brooklyn. Like you're definitely transported into a different place. And so, yeah, I think it's really fascinating how much he shares in common with so many of these other brash moonshot thinkers that we profiled here. The people that come to mind in addition to Elon Musk are people like Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, and even someone like Yvon Chouinard, who they have no qualms about just about speaking their mind.
Yeah.
when it comes to their respective fields.
Quite fearless, really. Quite fearless,
Mm-hmm.
And I'm look. What I'm really excited about is he actually breaks down how he got the courage and the mental models. In fact, this next clip that we're going to listen to is him giving a little bit his journey into his craft and practice of architecture. And what I want everyone to do is really tune in to what he says here, because he's going to give us this formula that he used to master architecture. So let's have a listen to Bjarke Ingels.
I think when I look at how I developed as an architect when I was a student, it was you can sort of describe it as sort of professional a serial monogamy in a way. That I would always fall in love with the work of an architect, and then I would like really dive deep into that, and then almost like digging so deep into this particular obsession that, and when you dig deep enough, you also reach a certain point where, and I think this is true in architecture and in art and probably in philosophy or technology or whatever, that at some point you reach the root assumptions. That once you start questioning those assumptions, the foundation of everything just collapses. and then that in a way frees you to look in another direction. It's almost like, in Nietzschean terms, he talks about how you philosophize with the hammer, that you hammer on these different concepts or like values to see if there's actually any substantial underpinnings behind. And sometimes there's a value that is no longer valid. It's a hollow concept, and it shatters when you hit it with the hammer. And I think in a way I studied architecture with a hammer for like a few years until I reached a certain point where I found an architect, Rem Koolhaas, who then ended up becoming my boss when I went to work for him, where he had a background in journalism. And I think what was interesting for me, what was eye-opening, was that all of their projects dealt with some kind of a situation, a political or a sort of economical, technological situation that in a way made the architecture reflect on society. This idea that architecture wasn't like an autonomous art form happening just within its own terms, but it was actually like in direct dialogue with things going on in society, became eye-opening to me.
I love how this clip builds on the last. It's almost Bjarke explaining how he's able to challenge convention. And this first principles thinking, again, a direct line to someone like Elon, who espouses, he calls it first principles thinking. Bjarke has an amazing metaphor of shattering with a hammer ideas when you inquire into them enough. So I think what I'm learning from this is Bjarke has become so contrarian because he doesn't take ideas at face value. He hits them
with a hammer.
With a hammer, yeah, to see how fragile they are. And it seems like what he's learned over the years is that many of these conventions, kind of ring false or hollow.
Absolutely. And the build I'd make on that, what this made me sort of extrapolate from this was he deconstructs in order to achieve mastery. Now, let me explain what I mean there. He breaks down a bit like Lego, really. Let's use architecture, his practice. He broke it down and asked, it reminded me of the Toyota ask why 5 times and you'll get to the root of anything, okay? Now, so he deconstructed it so then he is able to reassemble the pieces in a different order. So what I'm taking from this is if we want to master anything, just keep asking why until you get to the root of it and to the very, very first principles, and then reorganize those principles in a new way. This is almost like how you can become a contrarian innovator in any given space. I thought that was really, really powerful because it can apply to anything, can't it, Chad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another thing at the end of the clip, he's talking about Rem Koolhaas, who he worked for at OMA before starting his own practice. And Rem is certainly someone that we could have also profiled in this series.
Oh, yeah.
But he was talking about architecture not in isolation, but in dialogue with society. And I think what that kind of gives me a bit of a preview of is how important, and I think we'll hear this a bit later in the show, how important the people, the citizenry and the neighborhoods and the civic life and reality also informs what they're doing. And so there's this very interesting interplay between that, which I guess said in a way that more directly relates to the show, like it's very user-centered, the way he approaches it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you were to take the digital world, he's like all about UX, usability, user-centered design, human-centered design. And the way that works in architecture is they think about environmental conditions, social factors, the urban landscape, like the broadest sort of models by which humans can come into interaction with a space, you know. And isn't that crazy? I mean, this is exactly what you start to see with Elon when he thinks about getting people around cities better. You see this in so many of the innovators that we've studied, that they either directly or indirectly create better user or better human experiences.
Yeah. And even incorporating simple things like surprise and delight, is very important to what Big does.
And that really kind of launches us into this next thought from Elon, which is all about design. And, you know, he gets almost a little Dieter Rams on us, who we've featured on the show in this next clip. So let's kind of open up our minds to the world of design with Bjarke Ingels.
I think a major part of innovation is the migration of ideas. Good design is a design that is informed by specific information. What kind of a climate do you have? What kind of a building code do you have? What kind of a social behavior do you have and would you like to promote? So that everything you do is actually done for a specific purpose. Because I think good design is careful, bad design is careless. And what we're interested in is trying to find ways of using contemporary engineering, technology, the capacity to model and simulate and calculate to respond to the local climate in ways that are not based on machinery, but based on the design of the building, so that a building in Dubai is going to look radically different from a building in Copenhagen. So we don't call it architecture without architects, because that would be putting us out of a job. But we call it engineering without engines. I think what's in a bizarre way unique about our work is that we actually do what we say. So that like each project somehow we start by diving into the specific situation. What's the city? What's the landscape? What's the climate? What do the neighbors look like? What has to happen here? Like we try to look at all these practicalities, and we also try to see what do people normally do? Like how would you normally build this kind of school? So in the end, you can say like our buildings end up looking different because they perform different.
Yeah. For me, the key word there was good design is taking care. Care, said otherwise, could almost be empathy, couldn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm reading into that, is that while Bjarke doesn't talk about it in terms of, you know, design thinking or human-centered design, I think it's absolutely ingrained into their practice at Big, because they're not starting from like a brief maybe that a client gives them or a cool idea they have. They actually, you know, vacuum up all of the data and information and research about, like I was saying before, you know, the place and the people, the environment, and using that as the substrate for what they're building, so that it's kind of a natural extension, and instead of some like weird architectural sculpture that's, you know, completely out of place.
And I think that what's starting to reveal itself is his success comes from seeing his buildings in a almost anthropological context rather than an engineering structure in a given square footage. You know what I mean? Like it really feels like he's on a journey to make it integrate with a really broad set of factors, rather than like, I've got my square, I'm going to put the coolest thing I can think of on that square and job done.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I mean, it sounds to me like it's a very emergent process, and the ideas come from the site and the people, as opposed to, again, them forcing ideas. So kind of taken into maybe a digital product or, you know, tech product world, Bjarke and Big seem very focused on kind of problem finding as opposed to solution creating. So instead of me just getting a brilliant idea for my Uber for dog treats and building it and going out
Are
to
we
sell
back to that again? We're still
this
on
idea
that
is
one,
never
Chad?
going to die, Mike. It's so good. It's never going to die.
50 episodes later and it's still with us.
Right. It's a perfect idea. I came up with it. It's brilliant. And so I'm going to build it, and the world is going to eat it up. Right. Well, and that's kind of my point, is that instead of locking themselves in a studio and coming up with beautiful designs, and then, as you say, put them in the box, they're really letting the work emerge from the situation and from the environment, which I think is a big lesson for us, again, to not be so solution focused, and instead, be much more empathetic and allow the solutions to kind of emerge from the problems that we're discovering from our customers.
Now, what's crazy good for this next clip is if you take this thinking, once you've kind of taken the care to study the people and the space and the movement in a very broad context, you identify these big problems, and then you can kind of dream up fantastical new approaches. And this is really at the heart of their process. So we've been very fortunate to find almost different clips of Bjarke talking about their process and pulling it all together for our audience. This next clip talks about these big dreams that they have once they've kind of studied the context and how they can turn fiction into fact.
That is the power of architecture, is that you think of something, you imagine something, and then you start doing a lot of work. You do drawings, you find technical solutions, you solve the budgets, and then after sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, suddenly it's there. So it goes from being pure fiction, a figment of your imagination, into the world you live in. Like we came up with a crazy idea about skiing on the roofs of power plants. Now that's just reality in Copenhagen 1 year from now, or like 1 month from now. So in that sense, architecture literally is the art of turning fiction into fact.
Does that tie into the phrase, and I'm paraphrasing, that you said, we try to position ourselves in the small overlap between the avant-garde and the reliable and predictable?
It's like, that's actually, we have this notion we call pragmatic utopia. It ties into this idea of turning fiction into fact, that as human beings, we have the power to imagine and realize the world we want to live in. Pragmatic utopia is this idea of saying utopia is often used as a fictional, ideal future that is so perfect that it's impossible. But every time you're making a building or an urban space, you have the chance to make this little corner of the world, tiny little corner of the world, more like your dream world. So in that sense, we actually end up building utopia one step or one building at a time.
Wow. Could you imagine if Bjarke and Elon went to the same elementary school? I kind of think that they did, in the way that they speak about, kind of the world of possibilities when it comes to creating, your pragmatic utopia.
Well, you certainly get this sense of how vivid his mental models are, how big he dreams. And it feels like that's so related to understanding the context. And he understands the context so well from having deconstructed architecture. So this sort of his approach, we've sort of decoded in these 3 steps, which is decode the practice, take care to take in all the factors, and then dream big. And you can make fiction into fact. That, to me, serves not only architects well, but any budding entrepreneur or innovator. It's sort of a go-to playbook, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of Steve Jobs in that same line of thinking. It's people that refuse to believe that there are guardrails or constraints that's going to keep them from realizing their vision. Some people maybe went about it in a friendlier way than others, and some people had some big failures along the way. But I think we could say that there hasn't been too much downside in this thinking of turning turning fiction into fact. But I think one thing it's driving home for me is that I'll call it just a personality trait this belief that you can turn fiction into fact is something that's probably true for everyone that we've profiled. And as you said, it's kind of a true hallmark of an innovator, entrepreneur.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's really fun now is that you and I get a chance to dive into some of the work that he's done and talk about it. So we've mentioned the Lego building, Chad. Should we play a clip from Bjarke, perhaps talking about this crazy Lego building?
Yeah. And again, I would encourage everyone, if you go to moonshots.io, you'll find links to all the images and buildings and all the materials. As with all of the people that we profiled in this architects series, it really benefits from seeing these buildings that we've been discussing. But here's a clip talking about the new Lego museum.
If you're an architect and you're invited to create the home of Lego, and Lego is all about, building, we kind of made the dogma that we wouldn't design anything that wouldn't be immediately buildable in Lego. One aspect of Lego is to almost boil things down into the essentials with how few bricks can you actually make something recognizable. Also, we knew where it was going to be placed here in the heart of Billund, the hometown of Lego. Like symbolically almost replace the former city hall, the town that is very much about Lego. Instead of a city hall, you would have the Lego house. The idea was that maybe for the Lego house, just like the architecture of the Lego house is faithful to the proportions of Lego. Every artifact, every piece of furniture, so everything you touch in the Lego house is actually made out of Lego. With Lego, you can also do this sort of pixelation or voxelation, it's actually called when it's volumetric. So where you create organic shapes with many little bricks. And that's what happens with the pixel melt on the outside, where it almost becomes organic forms. So everything is like essentially 90 degrees only. And then the entire building is clad in ceramic tiles, really big, beautiful ceramic tiles. They're basically based on the proportions of 2x4s. The side elevation is 18 centimeters high. But the funny thing is, so 18 centimeters is like a classic measurement in architecture because it is the comfortable height of a step. When you scale the 2x4 up to 18 centimeters of height, it becomes exactly 60 centimeters long. It's almost the same as 2 feet. So all carpenters, all masons, they work with these, like everything comes in 60 measurements. It almost feels that, just like you say that in nature, everything is, with the golden ratio or the Fibonacci spirals. You can say in the building industry, everything somehow seems to be saturated with the measurements of Lego. The Da Vinci Code of architecture is somehow rooted in the proportions of Lego bricks.
He is riffing there. He has gone way past Elon Musk on that one.
Yeah. But I think for me, this is also just speaks to how passionate he is for what he does, turning fiction into fact and becoming like I'm hearing him get totally obsessed with Lego in the same way that, he taught himself architecture by obsessing with all of the greats. He just goes all in on Lego, and he becomes like Da Vinci, and he's like Neo in the Matrix. He sees the Matrix code, before his eyes.
It's really, you feel his energy there, and he was so in a state of flow. He's just like riffing like crazy. And I mean, yes, all our listeners should go and Google the Lego building and any of his buildings. They're very inspiring. We'll have a bunch of links to them in the show notes. But it truly was such a simple idea, because you should know that the Lego company, when they briefed him, they didn't tell him, can you build it out of Lego? That was his idea.
Mm-hmm.
And how crazy is it? They managed to not only do the structure, but the interiors, everything is Lego. And what a simple, but yet powerful idea that I'm sure is rooted in the fact that in that very early clip that he has decoded, he has deconstructed architecture to the point where it seems so logical to him to make it from Lego, yet nobody else had that idea. And I think that it's this kind of thinking that makes him so appealing to clients all around the world. And he recently
landed in my backyard.
He did land in your backyard. So why don't you set up this next clip, because it was absolute signature Bjarke, but also real recognition of his role, not only in architecture, but I think beyond in the ways we work.
Yeah. So I'm going to let the clip do most of the talking here, but a company that we've profiled on the Hot or Not show, I believe it was episode 38, WeWork. The founders were looking for someone that could think big enough to, partner with them in their huge ambitions for remaking the way we live and work. So of course, Bjarke was their guy. And he's now working with the founders at WeWork. As far as I can tell, most all of their new ventures. But here's some more from Bjarke on his new venture with WeWork.
Somehow the world was not geared for this kind of initiative, and I think what we're trying to do with WeWork is to, in a way, say the whole world has been obsessed with platforms. The internet as a platform, social media as a platform, but there's no platform more fundamental than the ground under your feet to actually provide the space for living and for working in a way that is much more tailored to the lives we actually live is a huge endeavor and has somehow not really been met so far. Like, I think another thing we're focusing on is even a fully occupied building is only a third occupied. Let's say a workspace, because people work typically from 9 to 5 or whatever, and then it's like pretty much empty except for some maintenance and a few people like struggling on a deadline. So, and then of course there's the weekends. So if there was ways we could actually turn on our urban landscapes by cohabiting them in different ways. Even human beings have different sleep patterns, because as a tribe, it was smart if some people in the population were more nocturnal and some were more sort of awake in the morning, because then the chance of being eaten by invading tigers or other tribes was lower if there was always someone awake. So I think in a similar way, as a society, we have to find ways to get much more activity, much more life out of the structures that we build.
What's so interesting to me about this clip is he's the consummate storyteller. And what I love is he's changing altitudes as he's speaking. So he's going from the very specific of like, this is how we work and this is where we work and this is how buildings are. And then he like zooms way out and is like, when we were tribes 10,000, years ago. And so he's kind of zooming in and out, from the single person up to the society to present day to the past. In some ways, it's very hard to track kind of where he is, at kind of what altitude or what time frame. So it's just interesting to me hearing him speak about his partnership with WeWork, just the kind of fluidity of his thought as he's moving between all those different modalities.
Yeah, and your mind boggles about what he could do on the scale of WeWork, right? Like, if you think about like the hundreds and hundreds of offices and buildings that he can now touch, inspire, change the way hundreds of thousands, if not now millions of people would work every day. I mean, this could be huge for rethinking how we work. And I'm sure a guy like Bjarke is just going to turn everything upside down for sure. Don't you think, Chad?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would love, and I don't know if we'll get there on the show. We've gotten some clues to it, but like, I want to know how he comes up with these ideas. Like, is it he's just not letting anything hold him back? It's because what he's talking about, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Like, all of the office buildings in Manhattan are unoccupied 2/3 of the time. And just think of not only just the wasted energy, but the wasted space and the wasted, the latent potential of all of that space. And so he's like, well, how do we get it so that all of those buildings are 100% occupied? And you're just like, yeah, why not? So it's funny. Every time, he says something, I'm like, well, yeah, why isn't that true? Why isn't that the case now? It's just fascinating to me how, I still want to know exactly, I want to like get into his brain and figure out how he comes up with some of these ideas, because, once you hear them, you're like, huh, yeah.
So simple, of course. But I mean, that's like anyone who's great at anything, be it a sportsman or a business person, they always make it look so easy. But in that, there's often, and I think what Bjarke talked about was years of just with a hammer smashing architecture apart, deconstructing it to its base level. And I think almost once you've learned how to do that, I think, first of all, when you master something, you're very comfortable remixing it, right? When you're not comfortable with something, it needs to be kind of almost rigid and you need to hold on to the rules. But when you just know it so well, you can say, oh, let's put B before A. What about C? Maybe put that up the front. And I think he's freestyling because he just knows it so well. But what a gift we've had so far, Chad. We've been able to go into the mind and the practices of someone who challenges the status quo and will have enormous impact on all of our lives, particularly with this WeWork deal. I'm just like, all right, what advice does he have? And where is his vision for the future? And we've got a couple more clips to kind of take us to those places. I mean, this guy really, for me, is all about challenging the status quo. So I'm really keen to hear what advice he has for us. So where should we start on that journey, Chad?
Yeah, well, before we get into the final section of the show, I did just want to mention, and this will be in the show notes, Bjarke was at South by Southwest here or in Austin in 2019, and he gave a really interesting talk with some fantastic visuals, like so much that we couldn't include hardly any of it. I don't know if any clips made it into this show, actually. If you search for Bjarke Ingels South by Southwest or Formgivening, sorry, I just butchered my my Danish, but it's a really great talk that he gives that goes into even more buildings that he's working on and completed. He goes into depth with the Copenhagen, as well as his plans for cities built on the water. And then, of course, in true Elon fashion, how we will build on Mars. So yeah, be sure to check out moonshots.io for all of that. But in terms of advice, we've got two really good pieces. And I don't think we'll be surprised to hear from Bjarke that a piece of advice is to do what you want. So here's Bjarke's first piece of advice for us.
It's very important that one of the main motivators in life is that you actually do what you want. My favorite philosopher is actually Nietzsche, but he was very inspired by Schopenhauer. And my favorite quote is, you can do what you want, but you cannot want what you want. And it's so true. Like you can actually, if you want something, you can do it or not. If you have the courage or the energy to do it, you can do it or not. But you can never decide what it is you want, because either you want it or you don't. So our office here in Copenhagen, we have maybe 25 different nationalities. One of the advantages of having multiple people collaborating from different cultures and different backgrounds is that the tendency to take things for granted diminishes, because nobody has exactly the same references. By bringing people together from different backgrounds, everything gets questioned. Nothing is taken for granted. And you end up turning more stones than you would otherwise. And you end up having these accidental discoveries.
Well, there was actually two little gifts in that. You know, as an aside, he was just talking about how diversity breeds this consideration, this openness, not taking things for granted because it's not a monolithic culture. But I would come back to the beginning of that. I love the singularity of do what you want. What you want is not a choice in terms of you either want it or you don't. But the choice to do it is another thing. I mean, you hear him speak and you're left with absolutely no doubt that he will do what he wants, meaning he will achieve his dreams, because there's just no way he could have achieved what he has achieved thus far without that drive. But there's something deeper in his voice that even we hear in Zaha, who was not as articulate as him. there is a certain tone, there's a certain delivery that we hear in all of these innovators. And the best way I can say it is there's a knowingness. It comes from putting in the hard yards and being relentless in pursuing their dreams. You just feel it, don't you, Chad?
Yeah, I also have like kind of a bit of the Nike just do it vibe here, where in a way I think it's a bit of a subtle dig to all of the entrepreneurs out there who maybe have these wants but don't act on them. And what I hear Bjarke saying is like, no, like you can choose to act on it. And we at Big are doing that, and that's why we're able to build these really interesting built environments for clients. And so I kind of take it as a bit of a, don't rest on your laurels, get off your ass and get out there and just do it.
And he doesn't stop there with his advice. We've got another one where Bjarke is really setting the scene for, what advice he would have for young architects. So let's jump into some advice from Bjarke Ingels.
I think for young architects, it's important, A, to care. Because if you don't care, it doesn't matter. B, to realize that we're not here to build for other architects. We're here to build for all of humankind in a way. And we're here to accommodate life and work of so many different people from so many different backgrounds. So that first of all, we really need to care about the people we are designing for, understand what their dreams and desires and priorities are. And then we have to use that understanding as the driving force of the work we put forward. Because the second we know what questions that are important, then all we have to do is answer them.
Well, he really, really brought a couple of themes back for me on that one. Did you notice he brings back this careful thing again? This is like a really subtle reference, but I think it's actually at the core of how he innovates, don't you?
Yeah, I'm having more. I think before doing the research on Bjarke, I saw him a bit as kind of like a real big personality and a bit bombastic, but it's hearing clips like this that really makes me appreciate his care for and empathy for the user. Now, the execution may be like a bit out there and a bit flashy or showy, but I think it's all rooted in this deep empathy for not the client even, but the people and the neighborhoods in which these buildings are going to live.
The other thing that you just continually get back from his approach is not only this care, but the feeling that from taking that care, he has the capacity, the inspiration to dream big. And I really love the way it all fits together. I really think he has this great capacity from almost being an anthropologist, studying the world and how it works. It's from that he gets his inspiration, which I think is a great way. If you're thinking about, I want to create a business, go and study the world in which you live and work in, and in Richard Branson style, see every problem as a business opportunity.
Right.
I really think this is at the heart of how he innovates. And I think there's a lot that we can take from him on this.
Yeah, so I think you helped me answer my question, Mike, and how Bjarke comes up with his ideas. And I think it is very Branson-esque. So I'm imagining Bjarke at his studio late at night. He's working on a deadline, and maybe he and his few team members are the only people there. And he probably looks around and says, wait a minute, there's all these computers and all this space that's not being used. Why is that? Like people could be having a dinner party here, or they could be, students could be studying here or something. So I think you're exactly right. It's always being hyper aware and attuned to those kind of discrepancies or frustrations. That's how Branson talked about all those frustrations out there.
Right.
And then those are the seeds of the ideas, that turn into some of these great accomplishments that we've seen from everyone that we've profiled here on the show.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the final inspiration we can take from Bjarke is really about how he sees the future. And I think that this really gets us into the thinking that he has, almost the horizon that he sees his work taking place in, and how he has such a big vision that automatically expands the ambition of any project that's brought to him. So he has some very strong thinking around what kind of world do we see in the future? What kind of world do we want to live in? And let's have a listen to him on our last clip. This is Bjarke Ingels talking about what kind of world do we want to live in.
Why should I even be interested in design or architecture? And it is because architecture is not a question of making it nice or pretty or this style or that style. It's a question of what kind of world do we want to create and what kind of world do we want to live in. Mm-hmm. And for instance, like I just had a son. He's 3 months old.
Congrats.
Thank you. And so he probably won't remember anything for like another 2 years. So he won't even know that there was a time when you couldn't ski on the roofs of the power plants. So imagine him and his entire generation, that's going to be something they take for granted. So imagine what they're going to ask for the environment, from the environment, and what they're going to imagine for the environment if skiing on power plant is their sort of baseline.
Yeah, I love it. It's almost answering the question of like why architecture matters.
Yes, totally. And I love how he sees it in this incremental, like he creates a shift. That's the new baseline. So he raises the level, and then you're like, well, what's the level that comes next?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very important trait that we've seen amongst many of the people we've profiled, is that you're surely not satisfied with the status quo and convention, and you're definitely looking around the next corner. But if you're a true innovator, you look around the next corner, and then you try and look around the next corner, right? So yeah, as you say, the next corner kind of becomes the ground truth and reality. So then it's okay, from there, how can we look around the next corner?
Yes.
And then if that's true, and what happens when we look around the next one? And it can be a very hard thought experiment, but that's something. There's a friend of mine that is a huge proponent of that kind of thinking. And whenever we go down those lines of thought, we usually end up in a pretty weird and wacky and cool place.
Well, it's interesting because when you think about all of the architects that we have covered in this series, every single one of them, I think, meets the criteria of being prolific.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is when we made a list of like our favorite houses, our favorite buildings from each of them, it's not like there was kind of one that we really, really liked. It's like there is a list of a dozen. And I think Lloyd Wright took the prize. I think he designed close to 1,000, had about 500 of those built. And I think Bjarke is just the same. You just look at incrementally the rate of his work, and he seems like he is not even close to retirement. I mean, this guy just feels like he's amping it up every time. It's increment. And I think that's what happens when you get in a state of flow. When you're doing what you love, when you've decoded it, then you're reassembling all of the parts and finding huge problems to go and solve and big dreams to make come true.
Mm. Yeah. And, he's quite, as you say, young in his career as an architect. So I'm very curious to see how much staying power he and his firm have, and how much of their ambitions they're able to realize. I mean, I mentioned this whole like building on Mars thing. Like he's got it all planned out. He's got the beautiful PowerPoint and everything. If it really happens remains to be seen. But I can say from my direct experience with his buildings in Copenhagen, I've been very delighted with them, and I can say that I would like to see more.
Very inspiring, and puts Copenhagen firmly back on my list. I've been there a long time ago. I got to get back there. So
Yeah, go in the summertime, and you can go to the harbor pool, which was his very first building. Or
Chad, or in the middle of the winter, man, I want to ski down a power plant.
Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, we'll have to go twice.
Well, I mean, what a fantastic architect to study. What a great person to learn from. All about breaking the status quo. He's Branson, he's Musk, and he's doing it in the world of architecture. I mean, Bjarke Ingels has so much to offer us, doesn't he?
Mm. Yeah, and for me, it's a nice cap. We kind of went in reverse order from kind of the heavyweights of a few years past, and then Zaha now are almost a contemporary of ours. It's been really fun to go through the century in architecture. Very, very different, I guess, realizations of their ideas, but as like a broken record, there's so many similarities between how they think and advice that they have for us, not just amongst themselves, but connected to all of the other entrepreneurs and innovators that we profiled on this show.
Right. And that brings me to the upcoming shows. Our next show is going to be a kind of a nice detour from the study of individual entrepreneurs. We're going to do our best of 2018, looking forward into the future of 2019 and beyond show. And we're hoping to have a special guest join us for that. That's going to be great. There's lots of things happening in the world of tech, the ups, the downs. We're seeing an IPO frenzy. We're seeing a social media crunch. Chad, there is so much for us to review in the world of startups, technology, and entrepreneurship. I'm really looking forward to the best of 2018, 2019 show, aren't you?
You have teased the series that comes after that show, and we have not revealed it yet.
You mean our favorite author?
Yeah. So our most popular show by far was show 41 with Simon Sinek. And to pay further homage to Simon and really dive deep and unpack his ideas, we've decided to spend an entire show on each of his books. So, drum roll, I'm pleased to announce that we will be doing not one, not two, but 5 shows on Simon and his amazing ideas that have come from all of his books, from Start With Why to Leaders That Eat Last, and all the way up to his most recent book, The Infinite Game.
Yeah, and look, this is not an indulgence on our side. I mean, 27,189 of you loved Simon Sinek. It is the all-time heavyweight show for us. And we personally love his work because Simon Sinek gives us so many clues onto what leadership looks like, how to become a great leader. And he has a wealth of wisdom that is so digestible, so usable, that with the upcoming launch of The Infinite Game, it feels only appropriate for us to double down on him and find out more about Simon and his work, but also to hear from you, our audience, why you love him so much, because we got so much love for that show. We're super pumped. And I can tell you that we've already begun the research on that, and some of the clips are so inspiring, and there's a lot inside of that. And it's going to be the longest special we've ever done, so we're ready to double down into the land of Simon Sinek.
Yeah, and I'm setting kind of a personal goal to try and get in touch with his publicity team as he's on his book tour. I know authors love to get on podcasts when they're coming out with books. So fingers crossed, we will fire a shot across his bow and see how close we can get. So if any of you listeners have any connections into the world of Simon Sinek, please reach out to us. And speaking of which, you can find all of the things that we've discussed on this show, all of our previous shows, at moonshots.io. And we really love and appreciate all of the feedback that we get. And of course, appreciate all of the reviews that you leave on iTunes. That helps other people discover and learn from the show, just like you.
Yeah. And don't forget, we love a good email. We got a lovely email very recently from a listener who thanked us for the show, but said, we make that commute to and from work just that much more manageable. And he loved all of the inspiring people that we study, and I can't tell you how much it means when people send in those notes. So keep them coming.
Yeah, for shows that you recorded, last year or even the year before. It's always great to hear from brand new listeners that are just discovering the show.
Yep. And we're now over. We're now 5 out of 5 stars on the iTunes store. We have over 10 reviews. We need more, folks. Get in there. Tell us what you think of the show. Give us a rating. We would really appreciate it. And we can't wait to dive into this next series of shows. Lots of good stuff coming up. So I think we're about done, don't you, Chad?
Yeah. The sun has finally set here. Although it's much, much later than it was in the dark and dreary winter. So again, I'm so excited that spring has arrived. But I'm super excited to be seeing you here live in person in New York in just a few weeks, Mike. I can't wait to have you here, and maybe we can, if not do a live show together, do some recording in person.
That sounds so good. All right. Well, listen, Chad, it's been wonderful. I can't wait for the show next week. Thank you to all our listeners. It's been great diving into the world of Bjarke Ingels. We've learned so much about challenging the status quo. I'm ready to go do it. So I'm going to sign off and say that's a wrap of the Moonshots podcast.